but is to make your reality smaller. And making your reality smaller coincides with prejudices and having firmly held opinions. So one thing that's kind of interesting is if we go back to your great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, the first in your ancestral line who could talk, or even the first before, the one right before you got speech, okay? Well, she had an entire universe that was about 30 miles, about the distance that she could walk in, a really hard day, and about 50 years. That was her entire universe, 30 miles and 50 years. 50 years because she could look around at people who were young and people who were old, and she could envision what she was going to be like, right? So she could say, oh yeah, I'm going to be great. I'm going to be like him someday. Damn, maybe I'll just end it today. But us, you, right? Anybody ever hear of the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago? Wow, have we expanded our universes? Here we are, there's this tiny, tiny bit of the electromagnetic spectrum that you can see. Well, we can detect all of this. I can get you equipment that you can see any of that stuff. Now, we've made our universes a lot bigger, but shutting them down will shut things down. So the last thing I wanted to say is that the farther we reach, the wider our net of empathy, discovery, creativity, and understanding. So with that, I'll leave you with the GoPro Seagull. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Ransom.
Thank you, Evan.
Questions? Does anybody have questions for Ransom? We'd love to discuss anybody's thoughts on the seagull video.
See, the seagull picked up the camera and now it's flying over this town in France and dropping it. It's the GoPro Seagull video. So it's got a different reality altogether.
So I have a question. At the beginning you talked about the cat and how it's like built in, that we know to be afraid of it. So how come when I see that little gray cat here, I'm not afraid of that?
Because it's small, and you are. Who are you kidding? I know you. No, it's because it's so small. Same reason that you wouldn't be afraid of a bear cub, but you'd be afraid of a grizzly. It doesn't fit that model. It doesn't, when you process the vision of that cat, it doesn't match up with the pattern that's already contained in your head of the thing you need to be afraid of.
I guess I don't have a specific question, but I found the part where you were talking about the relationship of our body to the Feynman, I guess, that very, very interesting, and I guess I was just wondering about what studies there have been on that particular relationship.
So you mean the timing?
The timing.
Yeah. So there's a preponderance of evidence that shows that we make decisions before we're aware of it. And that then when we become aware of it, we reorder the process so that it will make causal sense, so that the cause will come before the effect. So the kinds of experiments, they're extensive. There's zillions of them. And what they do is they use an electroencephalograph to measure I forget what they call it. It's the conscious intention, right? So there's a time when you make a decision, and then there's the time when you intend the decision. And the intention comes after the making. And you can measure this by having somebody do something, by telling them, when you see the blue dot, push this, and then and then do a separate experiment to show where the intention graph peaks. And so there's scads of these. I can't pull a bunch of examples out of my head, but virtually any neuroscience book you pick up will have a bunch of examples for this. Now, whether this is true for complex decisions is harder to say, because you kind of have to have a bunch of wires attached to your head for them to make this measurement. So when you buy a car, for example, there's this process of acquiring information. So that doesn't count, right? You have to acquire the information first before you make the decision. But somewhere in there, you probably make the decision before you rationalize it.
So is there, so I know there's psychotherapy where there's sort of rerouting through physical movement, and that's probably like a lot of the stuff, like Qigong, Tai Chi, incorporates that kind of thing in terms of like shifting your perspectives maybe through physical movement? Is that
So that's a different thing. And so there's examples of that, like, here's a really cool one that I could think of. There's this guy, V.S. Ramachandran at UCSD Medical School. And he's done these experiments. He's a neurologist. And he's done these experiments with people, amputees who have pain in their mythical limb, the limb that's the phantom limb. And so there's pain in those, and it hurts or it itches, and there's nowhere to scratch is the problem with it. So one treatment that he developed that has shown a lot of promise and has worked and relieved a lot of people's pain is to use a mirror. And so to project a mirror. So if my left arm's chopped off and coiled up and in pain because I can't uncoil it for whatever reason, then to use a mirror to show my right arm and to see that I can uncoil it and do it, that it retrains your neural networks, your thought processes, so that your brain believes that you've managed to scratch it, to stretch it out, and then it doesn't hurt anymore. So there's a lot of ways to use that for therapies.
I got really stuck at the beginning when you said that nobody can actually explain what thought is, so we'll just put that one aside and move on. And I thought, well...
Do you have a definition for thought?
Well, no, not exactly.
Yeah, me neither.
But,
I tried.
But it's so huge.
Right, so thought, the definition of thought, so the difference is we can all define thought as, something that comes to mind. Some perception, something that comes to mind, an idea. There's a million examples of it, but to get a minimal definition, what I would look for is something like when 5 different neurons interact at once. I would accept that as a definition. It's too arbitrary though, right? You need something where some number interacts in such a way, a minimum threshold of interactions or electric potential, so that it boils up to consciousness, or I don't even require that, but something.
Well, what about consciousness? I mean, what people are grappling with right now, this idea of consciousness. I mean, it does seem to sort of fill the bill in a certain way, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, but it's hardly minimal. So consciousness, being conscious, and I don't even think we need to be conscious of all of our thoughts. I'd be perfectly happy with a whole bunch of unconscious thoughts too. I'd take something very minimal. But consciousness is, of course, a lot of people think is the most interesting. I guess the people studying it think it's the most interesting question in science. Of course, every scientist thinks that what they're studying is the most interesting question in science. But consciousness, yeah, I think it's a very dynamic thing. So the latest thing on consciousness seems to me that it is an emergent property. And emergence, you think of a beehive, right? So a beehive is a set of a whole bunch of fairly simple creatures that interact in a way that becomes very complex. The neurons in your brain are a bunch of fairly simple processors that interact in very complex ways. You have 86 billion neurons, and each one has an average of 10,000 connections. There's a lot going on in there. So one really interesting way there's 2 ideas. One is that there's a threshold of complexity. So that at some point you reach a state of complexity. A creature reaches a state of complexity where they become aware, where they transcend from just being aware of their senses to actually experiencing what we think of as awareness, consciousness. And so that's the threshold effect. You can make very strong arguments for that based on a whole bunch of different physical ideas using phase transitions, like how ice converts to water, that there's a critical point where complexity reaches a stage where something becomes conscious. But there's also the idea of a spectrum, where something like a worm has very, very little consciousness, and something like a human has a whole shitload. And everything else is sort of somewhere in this spectrum. And there's a guy, Christoph Koch, at Caltech, who has come up with he and another guy in San Diego came up with a way to actually measure this. And it uses information entropy, which is a whole different talk in maybe my next book. But consciousness, for your money, I think it's all these things happening in your head in time. Time is very important because if you just take a snapshot, there's no consciousness. We're not conscious independent of time. So it's this rush of electrochemical reactions happening in a complex system as we move through time. I think of whitewater rafting. Yes?
It seems to me that you're pretty much positivist, and being physics. So there's another science phenomenology which has to be taken into account, and I want to introduce it through intuition maybe, because you've given 5 senses. Where would you put intuition, or would you deny intuition? And another little thing that I wonder, the timing is interesting here because they just realized that the sense of smell, that the human can detect trillions of different smells. 2 days ago, you probably
Yeah.
heard it, which is more than the millions of visual differences in color.
Well,
So we have a much more sensitive.
the first question was about, or the first point was about a distinction between intuition and, I guess in the positive sense.
Intuition as a sense.
Intuition as a sense, right. So since there is no distinct sensory apparatus specifically for intuition, it seems to me that intuition is an assimilation of our 5 senses and part of the processing network. So actually, in the chapter of this book that I'm working on here, what the hell am I doing? I'm breaking things is what I'm doing. Here, let me go back to this thing. I'm gonna end and go back to the beginning, and then I'm probably going way the hell too long, huh? So let's go up here to this thing. I think it's the next one, yeah. So there's this chapter on intelligence and intuition, chapter 5, which I just revised last week. And that is, so the idea here, in the state of the science anyway, is that intuition, that when we train ourselves, that intuition is partly trained and partly instinctual. And all these are feedback loops. So intuition consists of networks that fire very quickly. And they can fire without conscious awareness. And that's why things bubble up as though we haven't thought of them. As though they're magic. So the way I think of it is this. If you think of a pot with a bunch of water in it, and it's hot, and it boils, all of the bubbles don't make it to the top. So the steam that comes off, if we think of that in this metaphor as consciousness, and the water as unconsciousness, all this data that comes in through our senses that we don't process is in the water. But a lot of stuff boils up. Sometimes only the answer boils up. And we're not even aware of the various sensory inputs. We just get the answer. And that's what intuition seems to be. Or at least that's the material approach.
That would be the positive.
Yeah.
Approach. Another approach might be that it has no connection at all. That it's firstly information that has nothing to do with materialism, and then it's sensed by that materialism. So that's another possibility. You would say that.
So, well, one branch of phenomenology would, and I don't know, right? The point of my talk was not to deny, it was for me to have fewer opinions. So that's a really good note for us to end on.
You're starting with, but there's that balance it out.
Yeah, I agree. So thank you very much for that.
And what about the olfactory info that you just found?
The olfactory info, well, yeah, we have pretty good senses of smell, but nothing compared to dogs. The issue with the number of different senses goes back to a continuum detector rather than a discrete detector, though. Ultimately, we have somewhat discrete detectors of vision because we have just the 3. We detect the 3 different colors, but sense turns out might be more complex. Yeah, the sense of smell is really special. It's one of the most primitive. And one of the cool things about it, I don't know, just as a novelty, is that all of our senses, like our right eye, the information from our right eye is processed by our left brain. The information from our right ear is processed by our left ear. The information from our right nostril is processed by our right brain. Left nostril, left brain. It's the only sense that doesn't get switched. But that's all I really know about it. So we should listen to music now and move the chairs out of the way.
Wait,
One more?
one more, sorry. You opened up the talk with a comment about, an observation about how the evidence suggests that when we change the way we perceive, we tend to change our opinions about what's going on in reality and so on. And you closed with some thoughts about, if you can expand what you see, then you are capable of greater, you have a greater
Lateral
ability
thought, yeah.
to perhaps innovate or design systems that reflect more of what's going on. So in the beginning, it seemed to have a connotation of changing messing around with how the inputs get processed. You get these inputs, but then you shift your perspective, or your perception may change with the same inputs, and that causes you to change your opinions. And then at the end, it was more a concept of enlarging what you see. And it reminded me, and as soon as you began the talk and mentioning that thing about scrambling the perception, it made me think about, the drugs do that, for example. And it reminded me of a comment by William Gibson, who said basically he had this really dismissive attitude about drugs. All drugs are totally worthless because all it is scrambling, changing how the perception is put together, and like you're messing around with like this perceptual stream that comes to you, and that's all it is.
Altered perception.
And it always bothered me because it made me think, well, actually that could be extremely valuable. Like, if you do have these 5 windows, and then you put that together, to put it together in a different way, and then a different way, and then a different way, and then enter and leave these altered states, it gives you a lot of information indirectly.
I'm too old to drop acid anymore.
Right.
It just takes I fear it would take months to recover.
But
I was 18, it took 3 days.
But you know what I'm saying, and so...
I did not come right out and say that we should all drop acid and go and read poetry at the Hungry Eye, but it's not a bad idea.
Not a bad idea. And so okay, well that is part of what I was getting at, but a couple of words on this relationship because to just enlarge your spectrum of how much reality you can take in, I'm not sure how you do that directly. But this indirect way of changing your perception is helpful. So since you ended on that note...
So the way you actually do it is to listen, this metaphor of the water boiling up and all of, so you think of all your sensory data, your inner frog and your inner puppy are busy processing information, is to listen to them. So this is what meditation does, is that if you clear your head and really... here's a very good exercise. It works for a lot of people. It certainly works for me. And that is to look at, if you're studying a problem, if there's something, if you're working on a plot for a novel, if you're trying to figure out the right chord progression for a song, if you're creating anything, you write an app and you've got a bug, you're debugging code. I know for certain it works for debugging software and writing novels. And that is that you get all the information about that problem you can into your head, and then try like hell to forget it by doing something completely different and meditating, and the next time you shower, the answer will come to you, my son. All right, we really got to stop. Is it a quick one?
I'm actually more curious, one of the other chapters, since we're sitting in an art gallery, you're saying that about art and science, that it's a false dichotomy, which I happen to agree with, but as an opinion. So I'd like to hear more about that, and huge other subject, but perception as far as how we perceive art.
So right, these are big subjects. This is not a short question. But it boils down to value. In both cases, it boils down to value. There are lots of brilliant, awesome, important scientific experiments that were not appreciated for a long time. And the same obviously goes for art. And the only difference between science and art, independent of value, and this is what makes it very messy, is that art is so subjective, and we think of science as not being subjective, but it is. If we discover the wrong thing at the wrong time, it won't be valued. If we discover something way out of context, no one will get it. It won't fit in, so it won't be valued. With art, if you do something that's too much the same, it won't be valued. If you do something that's too different, it won't be valued. I'm afraid it boils down to marketing. And I say that mostly, hopefully tongue-in-cheek, but fearfully not. All right. Thank you very much.